What would you do if you discovered that your ancestors had been buried facing the wrong direction, not by accident, but as punishment? Not as desecration, but as duty, as the only way to protect the living from the dead. Welcome to this journey into one of the most haunting mysteries in Appalachian death folklore. But before we descend into these hills where the dead were laid to rest in deliberate shame, I need you to ask yourself, do the sins of a person follow them beyond the grave? Should they, and if so, who decides what punishment awaits them in the earth? Tell us where you're watching from right now and whether you believe the dead should rest differently based on how they lived, because by the end of this account, you may question everything you thought you knew about burial, redemption, and the possibility that some doors, once closed, should never be reopened. This episode contains discussions of death, historical violence, and disturbing ritualistic practices. We present these accounts with profound respect for those involved. This is not entertainment. This is testimony. If you're sensitive to discussions of death, suffering, or cultural practices involving the deceased, please care for yourself first. In the mountains of eastern Kentucky, 3 miles from any town large enough to have a stoplight, there exists a cemetery that appears on no official maps. The locals call it Snake Hill, though no one seems to remember why. County records show 72 graves. The actual count, when you walk the grounds yourself, is 97, and every single headstone, every single one faces west. In traditional Christian burial, the dead face east, toward the rising sun, toward Jerusalem, toward resurrection morning when Christ returns and the graves give up their dead. It's a practice so old, so fundamental, that most gravediggers follow it without thinking, the way you breathe without counting your breaths. But at Snake Hill, something went terribly, deliberately wrong. What you're about to discover is a mystery that spans 3 centuries, where one community developed a burial practice so disturbing, so laden with fear and superstition, that they kept it secret even from their own children until those children became old enough to help dig the graves. This isn't just about the dead. This is about what happens when an entire community believes that some souls are so corrupted, so dangerous, that they must be imprisoned in the earth itself, facing away from salvation, away from hope, away from any possibility of peace. This is about the question that haunts us all. What if death isn't the end of punishment? What if the grave is just the beginning? It was the year 1879. Rutherford B. Hayes was president. Thomas Edison had just invented the light bulb, and most of America was racing forward into the modern age. But in the remote hollows of Breathitt County, Kentucky, where the mountains rose so steep that winter darkness came at 3 in the afternoon, where families had lived in the same cabins for 5 generations without seeing the need to change a single stone, modernity was something that happened to other people, in other places, in a world that seemed as distant as the moon. This is where our story begins, in a place where the old ways had roots that went deeper than the graves themselves. The mountains of eastern Kentucky have a presence that defies simple description. These aren't the majestic peaks of Colorado or the gentle rolls of the Smokies. These are old mountains, worn down by time into something more intimate and more menacing mountains that crowd close like gossiping neighbors, that hold mist in their valleys like a secret they'll never tell, that seem to watch you with a patience that comes from having witnessed centuries of human foolishness and suffering. The hollers, those narrow valleys between the ridges where communities huddled like refugees from a war no one could quite name, had a particular quality of isolation. Not the romantic isolation of a mountain cabin in a tourism brochure, but the kind of isolation that meant a child could die of fever before anyone could reach a doctor, the kind that meant nearest law enforcement was 3 days' ride away, the kind that meant communities had to be their own judge, their own jury, their own executioner, and their own gravedigger, and their own theologian. In these mountains, Christianity had mixed with older things, Irish folk beliefs that came over on ships in the 1700s, Cherokee traditions that survived in whispers and warnings, and something even older, something that might have been here before humans gave it a name. The result was a faith that would have seemed strange to city churches, a faith that believed in salvation but also in haints, in redemption but also in curses that could follow a bloodline for 7 generations, in the mercy of God, but also in the very real possibility that some souls were beyond even his reach. This was the soil, both literal and spiritual, in which Snake Hill Cemetery took root. The cemetery itself sits on a rise that would be called a hill anywhere else, but in Kentucky is barely worth mentioning. A slight elevation in terrain that gives just enough elevation to keep graves from flooding when the spring rains turn the creeks into rivers. The ground is rocky, which makes digging difficult, which makes every burial an investment of labor and intention. You don't dig in this ground casually. You dig because you must, and you remember the effort forever. The oldest legible stone dates to 1868, though there are worn markers that might be older, their inscriptions erased by more than a century of rain and ice, and the patient work of lichen. The names, when you can read them, are familiar Appalachian surnames: Collins, Combs, Strong, Ritchie, Noble. Family names that appear in county records going back to the earliest settlements, names that married into each other until the family trees became less like trees and more like dense, tangled thickets where everyone was cousin to everyone else in at least 3 different ways. But there's something wrong with this place that you feel before you understand it. The light falls differently here. Trees that should grow straight have a subtle lean, as if trying to move away from something. Birds that should be singing in the canopy are silent, or sing from the edges of the clearing, never from directly overhead. The temperature is always 3 or 4 degrees cooler than the surrounding woods, even in summer, even at noon. And those headstones, every single one, face west, toward the setting sun, toward darkness, toward ending rather than beginning. The first person to document this publicly was a folklorist named Margaret Haversham in 1937. She was part of the Federal Writers Project, that brief flowering of the New Deal when the government decided that American folk culture was worth preserving, and sent educated people into the hills with notebooks and recording devices to capture stories before the last generation that knew them died away. Margaret was 26 years old, a graduate of Wellesley College, born in Boston to a family that had never known hunger or hard labor, or the kind of isolation that could make a person strange. She arrived in Breathitt County with romantic notions about Appalachian culture, about the noble simplicity of mountain life, about finding pure American ballads sung in accents that preserved Elizabethan English. What she found instead changed her so profoundly that she never published her Kentucky research, never spoke about it publicly, and spent the last 43 years of her life living in a small apartment in Boston, teaching high school English, and drinking herself into a quiet, steady decline that ended with her death in 1980 at the age of 69. But she left her notes, 47 pages of typed field observations, with handwritten marginalia that grows increasingly frantic as the pages progress. These notes, discovered in a trunk by her niece in 2003, provide our first documented account of what the people of Breathitt County believed about Snake Hill Cemetery and the souls buried there. Margaret's first entry is dated July 14, 1937, arrived in Troublesome Creek area after 8-hour drive from Lexington. The last 40 miles were barely passable roads, more like creek beds, My guide, a local man named Silas Ritchie, took me to meet his grandmother, Cora Ritchie née Collins, age 87, who he promised knew all the old stories. Mrs. Collins received me politely but with clear suspicion. It took 3 visits before she would speak to me with any candor, and only after I proved I could keep a secret by not mentioning to the local minister something she'd told me about folk remedies involving graveyard dirt. The detail about graveyard dirt should have been Margaret's first warning. In Appalachian folk magic, graveyard dirt is powerful, but its power depends entirely on whose grave it comes from. Dirt from the grave of a murder victim can be used to seek justice. Dirt from a child's grave for protection. Dirt from a crossroads grave for control and domination. But dirt from the wrong kind of grave, from a suicide's grave, from the grave of someone who died by violence they committed, from graves that face the wrong direction, that dirt is poison. That dirt is curse material. That dirt is something you handle only if you know exactly what you're doing and exactly what price you're willing to pay. Cora Collins knew this, and she was testing whether Margaret knew it too. Margaret's notes from July 29th. Mrs. Collins finally agreed to show me the reversed cemetery, as she calls it. We walked for approximately 2 hours into the hills. The path was barely visible. Silas explained that the family only visits the cemetery twice a year, on All Saints' Day and on Midsummer Eve, and that regular visiting would be inappropriate and potentially dangerous. When I asked why, he looked at his grandmother, who said simply, "Because them that's buried there need to stay buried. Visiting is an invitation." An invitation to what? Margaret didn't ask then, perhaps sensing that pushing would end the conversation entirely. But her handwritten notes in the margin show her beginning to feel the unease. Why does she keep touching her left thumb to her forehead when she mentions the cemetery? The gesture seemed unconscious, protective. The gesture is an old one, older than Christianity in these mountains. It's a ward against evil, a sign of crossing oneself without making the full Christian cross, just a thumb to the forehead, where the third eye is said to open, where spirits can enter if you're not careful. When they reached Snake Hill, Margaret's notes become less organized, more stream of consciousness. The cemetery is in a clearing that feels artificial, as if the trees were cut back and then refused to grow again. Approximately 100 graves, though many markers are too worn to read, but the orientation every single stone faces west. I asked Mrs. Collins if this was intentional. She looked at me as if I'd asked whether water is wet. "Of course it's intentional," she said. "These are the reversed graves. These are for the unshriven." Unshriven. It's an old word, almost archaic even in 1937. It means someone who died without confession, without absolution, without the last rites. In Catholic tradition, to die unshriven meant to die with your sins still on your soul, means to face judgment with no advocate, no mercy, no chance for paradise. But the people buried at Snake Hill weren't Catholic. They were mostly Baptist or Methodist, or the kind of non-denominational mountain Christianity that predated formal denominations. Yet they'd kept this word, this concept, and built an entire burial practice around it. Margaret pressed further. I asked what made someone unshriven in their tradition. Mrs. Collins became uncomfortable. She looked at Silas, who looked away. Finally, she said, "You have to understand that in the old days, in the real old days, there was no law up here. We were our own law, and some things that happened, some things people did, they couldn't be forgiven by the church, they couldn't be forgiven by God, they could only be contained, not punished, not condemned. Contained when someone like that died." Mrs. Collins continued, "And they always died eventually, one way or another. The community had to decide what to do with the body. Couldn't bury them in sanctified ground. That would pollute the earth. For everyone else, couldn't burn them. That would release what was in them into the air, into the smoke. Couldn't leave them unburied. That would be worse than anything. So we did what had to be done. We reversed them. Margaret's handwritten notes show her struggling. What does reversed actually mean? The headstone faces west. But what about the body itself? She asked. The answer is recorded in her neat typing with 3 exclamation points added by hand. We bury them face down, Mrs. Collins said. Face down, facing west, at the western edge of the cemetery, as far from the sunrise as we can place them. We bury them deep 7 feet when we can manage it in this rocky ground. And we bury them in oak coffins with no metal, because metal conducts, and we don't want nothing conducting from them into the earth. We mark the grave so people know to be careful, but we don't visit, we don't tend it, we don't plant flowers, we let the grave get grown over. We let it be forgotten by everything except the written record, because someone has to remember where they are, so we don't accidentally disturb them later. Face down, 7 feet deep, no metal, don't visit, don't tend, don't remember except in records. These aren't Christian burial practices. These are something far older, something that speaks to a terror of the dead that Christianity tried to civilize but never quite erased. Margaret asked the obvious question, what happens if someone does disturb the grave? Mrs. Collins's answer is recorded in Margaret's increasingly shaky handwriting. Then they come back. Not as ghosts. Ghosts are memories, ghosts are echoes. These come back as something worse, as something hungry, as something that remembers being denied and wants to balance the books. To understand why the people of Breathitt County developed this practice, you have to understand what unshrivable meant in their context. What crimes, what acts, what violations of the human contract were so profound that they required this extreme response. Margaret Haversham spent the next 3 weeks interviewing elderly residents about the history of Snake Hill, and the pattern that emerges from her notes is both specific and terrifying. The reversed graves weren't for ordinary sinners. Everyone sins. Everyone falls short of the glory of God, as the preachers said every Sunday. The reversed graves weren't even for murderers, necessarily. Murder, in the context of mountain feuds and self-defense and the absence of reliable law enforcement, was a sin that could be confessed, forgiven, reconciled with God and community. No, the reversed graves were for something else, something that the community recognized as corruption of the soul itself. From Margaret's interview with Elijah Strong, age 73, August 7, 1937, there was a man in my grandfather's time named Hiram Collier. This would have been in 1860s, right after the war. Hiram came back from that war changed, not just sad or broken like many men. Changed in his nature, he started doing things, cruel things, first to animals, then to people's livestock, then, worse things. The community tried to help him. The preacher tried to cast out what was in him. But some things, once they're in deep, they can't be cast out. They have to be contained. What did he do? Margaret asked. The kind of things we don't speak about in detail. Elijah replied. But children started disappearing, 3 of them over 2 years, and Hiram was always nearby when it happened, always had an explanation, always had an alibi that couldn't quite be proven or disproven. Then one day, a boy of 9 went missing, and this time they searched Hiram's property without asking permission. What they found, the typed record breaks off. Margaret's handwritten note says only, he wept and couldn't continue, but he said, they killed him that day, not law, just men, just fathers, and when they buried him reversed, because they knew that what was in him couldn't be allowed to rise. From interview with Sarah Noble, age 81, August 10, 1937, my mama told me about a woman named Granny Shade. That wasn't her Christian name, but that's what everyone called Her because she lived in the darkest holler, where the sun never quite reached even at noon. Granny Shade was a midwife, and for years she was valued, respected even, because infant mortality was so high and she had a good record of bringing babies into the world alive. But then people started noticing a pattern. Some of the babies she delivered, particularly babies from families that had offended her or that couldn't pay, those babies started dying, not immediately, usually within the first month, and always the same way. They just stopped breathing in their sleep. Crib death. Margaret noted, "It happens. It does happen." Sarah agreed. But it was happening too often in Granny Shade's cases, and always to specific families. Finally, a woman named Catherine Combs got suspicious when her baby died after Granny Shade had been heard muttering curses during a difficult delivery. Catherine searched her baby's cradle and found a poppet, a little cloth doll stuffed with grave dirt and thorns hidden in the ticking. She took it to the preacher, who took it to the men of the community, and they went to confront Granny Shade. Did they find evidence? Margaret asked. They found 17 poppets in her cabin, 17, each labeled with a family name. Some of the families had already lost babies, some hadn't yet. The men burned the cabin that night, with Granny Shade inside it, and when they buried what was left, they buried it reversed, face down, at the western edge where nothing grows now but poison sumac and nightshade. Child killers, torturers, those who practiced malevolent magic against the innocent. The pattern continues through Margaret's interviews. 23 documented cases over 70 years, each one involving acts that the community deemed not just criminal, but spiritually corrupting. Acts that marked the perpetrator as containing something that death wouldn't cure, something that would persist beyond the grave unless specific measures were taken. But here's what makes the practice truly disturbing. Most of these people weren't convicted of anything. There were no trials, no juries, no appeals. The community decided collectively, executed the sentence, usually death, though sometimes the person died naturally, and then performed the reversed burial as both punishment and protection. They were taking no chances with the soul. They were making sure that even if they were wrong about the person's guilt, even if God in His infinite mercy decided to forgive the unforgivable, the physical orientation of the body would serve as a barrier, a delay, a warning to anything trying to rise. From Margaret's notes, August 15, 1937, after interviewing 12 people about the practice, "I'm beginning to understand that Snake Hill Cemetery isn't primarily about punishment, it's about quarantine. These people genuinely believe that certain souls are infectious, that they carry a spiritual contagion that can spread if not contained. The reversed burial is their version of a lead-lined coffin, a sealed vault, a grave that serves the same function as a prison, not to reform or punish, but simply to keep the dangerous thing away from the vulnerable public." She underlined "infectious" 3 times. And then, in handwriting that suggests she wrote it late at night, possibly by candlelight, possibly after several drinks. But what if they're right? What if I'm applying modern skepticism to something I don't fully understand? What if there are people who carry something that doesn't die with the body? I feel insane even writing this, but after 3 weeks in these mountains, after seeing the absolute conviction in these people's eyes, after feeling the atmosphere of that cemetery myself, I'm not sure what I believe anymore. Margaret Haversham's research took a darker turn in the 4th week of August 1937. This is when she met a man I'll call Thomas. She never recorded his full name, referring to him only as T in her notes, and I'll respect that choice, even though I've been able to identify him through other records. Thomas was 42 years old, a coal miner with black lung who knew he was dying. He'd been born in Breathitt County, left for work in the mining towns of West Virginia, and returned home to die in familiar mountains. And he had a story to tell, a story that Margaret initially dismissed as fever delirium, but eventually came to believe, or at least to fear might be true. Thomas's grandfather, Micah, had been one of the men who killed Hiram Collier back in the 1860s, one of the men who buried him reversed at Snake Hill. This wasn't a secret in the family, it was spoken of openly, with a mixture of shame and grim necessity. Micah had done what needed doing, the family said. He'd protected the community. He'd paid the price that came with such action. The price was dreams. Nightmares that started immediately after the burial and continued for the rest of Micah's life. 4 more years of seeing Hiram Collier in his sleep, not as a ghost, but as something worse. Something that was trying to claw its way back up through 7 feet of rocky Kentucky soil. Something that was calling to Micah specifically because Micah had been the one to deliver the killing blow with a coal shovel. But that wasn't the story Thomas told Margaret. That was just the background, the context for what came later. In 1913, 50 years after Hiram Collier was buried reversed at Snake Hill, a lumber company arrived in Breathitt County with plans to cut several thousand acres of old-growth forest. The company needed a road through the mountains, and the most practical route happened to pass directly through the edge of Snake Hill Cemetery. The company approached the community with an offer. They would pay to relocate the cemetery to a new location, would handle all the exhumation and reburial, would even provide new headstones. It was a generous offer by the standards of the time, when lumber companies usually just plowed through whatever stood in their way. The community refused, absolutely, categorically refused. The company raised their offer. The community refused again. The company threatened legal action. The community, which had rarely shown any unified front about anything else, stood absolutely firm. Snake Hill Cemetery could not be disturbed. The graves must not be exhumed. The road would have to go around, however much longer and more expensive that route might be. The lumber company, frustrated and baffled, decided to proceed without permission. They sent a crew of 12 men to begin exhumation on October 7, 1913, a date that Thomas remembered precisely because his grandfather had marked it in the family Bible with notation, "The breaking of the seal." The crew arrived at dawn with shovels, pickaxes, and wooden crates for transporting remains. The foreman, a man from Tennessee named Robert Vance, had been told about the local superstitions and had dismissed them as hillbilly nonsense. He assigned 4 men to start with the oldest, most deteriorated graves at the western edge. The reversed graves, though he didn't know that's what they were. By 10 o'clock that morning, 2 of the men refused to continue. They'd uncovered the first coffin, a simple oak box, in surprisingly good condition given its age, and when they'd opened it to transfer the remains, they'd found the skeleton positioned face down, arms apparently bound to its sides with rusted wire, and something else. Objects placed in the coffin with the body. A Bible with pages torn out, a knife with the blade snapped, a handful of iron nails bent into unnatural shapes. The foreman dismissed this as primitive burial customs and ordered the men to continue. They refused. He fired them on the spot. 2 other workers volunteered to complete the job, motivated by the promise of the fired men's wages. By noon, something had gone wrong. From Thomas's account, as recorded by Margaret, my grandfather was working his own property 2 miles away when he heard the screaming. He said it wasn't like any sound he'd heard a human make. More like an animal caught in a trap, but worse because you knew it came from a human throat, and that whatever was causing it was worse than any trap. He dropped his tools and ran toward the sound, and he wasn't the only one. Seemed like every man within hearing distance was running toward Snake Hill. What they found was carnage that defied explanation. 4 of the lumber company's workers were dead. 3 others were injured so badly they'd die within the week. The remaining 5 were either catatonic or screaming incoherently about the man in the ground who wouldn't stay down. The foreman, Robert Vance, was dead in a way that the county coroner couldn't adequately explain. His neck was broken, his ribs crushed, and his body was positioned in the partially exhumed grave of Hiram Collier, positioned face down, in the exact orientation of the corpse they'd been trying to remove. The 3 men who'd been actively working on the exhumation were dead of what appeared to be massive simultaneous heart attacks. Despite being in their 20s and 30s and in good physical health, their faces, according to multiple witnesses, were frozen in expressions of absolute terror. One man had apparently fled into the woods and been found 3 hours later hanging from a tree, though whether by suicide or by some other means was never determined. The branch he hung from was too high to have reached from the ground, and there was no ladder, no stump, no way he could have climbed up there. The law came from the county seat, Thomas told Margaret. They investigated, they wrote it up as accident involving industrial equipment, even though there was no equipment anywhere near those bodies except shovels and pickaxes. They knew what had happened, everyone knew, but you can't write killed by a corpse they disturbed in an official report. You can't write some graves should never be opened in a death certificate. The lumber company abandoned their plans immediately. The road went around Snake Hill, adding 17 miles and 3 months to the project. The relocated cemetery offer was never mentioned again, and the partially exhumed grave of Hiram Collier was filled back in, but not before the community took additional measures. They reburied him at 9 feet instead of 7. They placed a capstone over the grave, a flat piece of limestone weighing over 300 pounds. And they carved into that stone a single word in Latin that none of them could read, but that had been passed down from some earlier generation as the proper word for this kind of grave: immutere. It means to contain or to confine, but the older Latin meaning, the meaning that would have been understood by someone educated in medieval church doctrine, is more specific: to prevent transformation. They weren't just trying to keep Hiram Collier's body in the ground. They were trying to keep whatever was in him from becoming something worse. Margaret Haversham left Breathitt County on August 30th, 1937. Her final field notes are dated August 28th, and they're written in handwriting that barely resembles her earlier neat script. I went back to the cemetery alone. I know I shouldn't have. Silas warned me not to, but I had to see it in full daylight by myself, without the filter of local superstition and fearful guides. I had to prove to myself that it was just a cemetery, just graves, just stones and bones and earth. I arrived at noon, full sunlight, birds singing in the distance, a rational hour, a rational day, a rational mind. I walked among the reversed graves reading names, reading dates, calculating ages at death. Most died young 20s and 30s. Violent deaths, almost certainly, based on the dates and what I knew of their stories. I told myself I was a scientist, a folklorist, an observer of cultural practices, not a believer in folk magic. Then I reached Hiram Collier's grave with its limestone capstone and its single Latin word, and I made a mistake. I sat down on the stone, just for a moment, just to rest, just because I was tired from the walk and the heat and the weight of 3 weeks of disturbing stories. I don't know how long I sat there. It felt like minutes, but when I stood up and checked my watch, 3 hours had passed, 3 hours gone like nothing, and I don't remember any of it except one image, one sensation that I can't shake, that follows me even now as I write this in my boarding house room 30 miles away. The sensation of being pressed face down into earth unable to move, unable to scream, unable to die, while something above me, or below me, I couldn't tell which, whispered in a voice that sounded like soil falling on wood, "She sat on my grave, she'll carry me with her. Just a little bit, just enough." I ran. God help me, I ran from that cemetery like a child fleeing a nightmare, and I didn't stop running until I'd reached Silas Ritchie's house, where I collapsed on his porch, sobbing and incoherent. Silas took one look at me and said, "You sat on one of the reversed stones." It wasn't a question. He brought me inside, made me wash my hands and face 7 times in water mixed with salt and what he called sacred herbs. Looked like sage and sweetgrass to me. He made me turn my clothes inside out and wear them that way for 3 days. He gave me a small cloth bag filled with dirt. From a child's grave, he specified, innocent dirt to counter the poisoned, and told me to keep it with me always and to never return to Snake Hill, and to never, ever, write about what happened there. I promised him I would, but I lied. Because I have to write this, I have to document this. Even if I never publish it, even if no one ever reads it, I have to record what I learned in these mountains, what I saw, what I, God help me, what I felt sitting on that stone. Some graves are reversed not to punish the dead, but to protect the living. Some things that die don't stay dead unless you make them stay dead. And the people of these mountains, for all their poverty and isolation and lack of formal education, understand something about the nature of evil that our modern world has forgotten. That it persists, that it hungers, that it waits. The field notes end there. Margaret Haversham never returned to Kentucky. She never published her research. According to her niece, who discovered the notes after Margaret's death, Margaret kept the cloth bag of innocent dirt with her until the day she died, kept it in her purse. Then later, when she became too ill to leave her apartment, kept it under her pillow. The niece, thinking it was trash, threw it away. 3 days later, she reported experiencing nightmares about being buried alive. These nightmares continued for 7 months, then stopped as suddenly as they'd started. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The story of Snake Hill doesn't end with Margaret Haversham's retreat. If anything, her departure just marks the end of the first act. The investigation, the discovery, the naive belief that understanding something is enough to contain it. What comes next is what happens when the warning goes unheeded. For 60 years after Margaret Haversham fled Snake Hill Cemetery, the place was left alone. The lumber company had learned its lesson. The community continued its tradition of reversed burials became less common as the most egregious crimes became less common, or perhaps as the community lost its certainty about what required such measures. The last confirmed reversed burial at Snake Hill was in 1943. A man named Garrett Combs, who killed his wife, his 3 children, and his mother-in-law before dying by his own hand. The community buried him face down at the western edge without discussion, without debate. Some traditions don't need words. But times were changing. The young people were leaving for jobs in Lexington, in Cincinnati, in places where coal mines weren't played out, and the future seemed to hold more promise than subsistence farming on rocky mountain soil. The population of Breathitt County declined. Old families died out or married into other lines. The specific knowledge about Snake Hill, who was buried there, why they were buried reversed, what the dangers were, began to fade from living memory into written record, and then from written record into rumor, and then from rumor into the kind of story teenagers tell each other to prove their bravery. By the 1990s, Snake Hill had become something between a legend and a joke. Local kids would dare each other to spend the night in the cemetery, to touch the reversed stones, to dig in the graves. Most didn't follow through. Those who did usually came back with nothing more than dirty hands and inflated stories about mysterious lights or strange sounds, the normal products of adolescent imagination and woods at night. But in the summer of 2004, someone came to Snake Hill with intentions that were neither teenage bravado nor scholarly research. Someone came with specific knowledge, specific plans, and specific needs that could only be fulfilled by what lay in those reversed graves. His name was Michael Pritchard, and he was a collector. Not a collector of antiques or art or any of the usual obsessions. Michael Pritchard collected objects associated with violent death, murder weapons, fragments of hangman's nooses, bricks from demolished execution chambers, personal effects of serial killers. His collection, housed in a climate-controlled warehouse in Louisville, was rumored to be worth millions to the right buyers in the disturbing corners of the dark web where such things are traded. But Pritchard didn't collect for money. He collected, according to later psychiatric evaluations, because he believed that objects associated with extreme evil retained a kind of power, a spiritual residue that he could somehow harness or at least experience by proximity. He was, in the cold language of psychology, a death-obsessed narcissist with magical thinking and a compulsive need to transgress boundaries. In the colorful language of his few associates, he was a man looking to catch something dark. How Pritchard learned about Snake Hill is unclear. He may have come across Margaret Haversham's field notes, which had been deposited in an archive at the University of Kentucky after her niece donated them in 2003. He may have read about the 1913 incident in historical newspaper archives. Or he may have been directed there by someone in the underground network of occultists and dark collectors who trade information about such places the way birdwatchers trade information about rare species sightings. What is clear is that by June of 2004, Pritchard had identified 3 specific graves at Snake Hill as targets for what he called acquisition. He'd researched the cases, knew the names, knew the stories. He wanted artifacts from the graves of Hiram Collier, Granny Shade, and Garrett Combs, the child killer, the baby murderer, and the family annihilator. He wanted objects that had been buried with them, objects that had lain in contact with their remains for decades, objects that would carry, he believed, the strongest possible spiritual contamination. He arrived at Snake Hill on June 21, 2004, the summer solstice, deliberately chosen because he believed that the barriers between worlds were thinnest on solstice days. He came equipped with professional grave, digging tools, a GPS unit to document exact locations, and a digital camera to record the exhumation process. He came alone. This would prove to be both his greatest mistake and the community's greatest protection. What happened next, we know from 3 sources: Pritchard's own video footage, recovered from his camera after the event; the testimony of Silas Ritchie's grandson, also named Silas, who happened to be hunting in the area and heard sounds from the cemetery; and the physical evidence left at the scene. Pritchard began his excavation at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, starting with what he believed was Hiram Collier's grave, the one with the limestone capstone and the Latin inscription. He used a portable winch to lift the stone, an act that took him nearly an hour and required anchoring the winch to a tree 30 feet away. The video footage shows him narrating his actions in a tone of excited scholarly detachment. The stone is heavier than expected, approximately 300 pounds based on the winch specifications. The carving appears to be hand-chiseled, probably period, contemporary with the burial. I'm documenting the exact position before removal for potential restoration purposes. The stone came free. Pritchard rolled it aside and began digging in the disturbed earth beneath. The video shows his increasing excitement as he went deeper, passing through layers of soil that showed clear signs of previous excavation, presumably the refilling after the 1913 incident. At approximately 4:30 p.m., he reached the coffin, or what was left of it. The oak had held up remarkably well for a burial that was now 141 years old, but time and pressure had collapsed the lid. Pritchard's video shows him carefully removing fragments of wood, exclaiming over the quality of the craftsmanship, noting the absence of metal fasteners. Then he reached the remains. The video shows a moment of confusion. Pritchard is silent for almost 30 seconds, the camera pointed down into the grave, showing bones positioned face down as expected. But something is wrong with the skeleton itself. The bones are wrong, twisted in ways that bones shouldn't twist, arranged in configurations that don't match human anatomy. The skull is face down, yes, but it's also partially rotated, as if the person had tried to look over their shoulder while lying prone, had tried so hard that the vertebrae had actually turned far beyond what living bone could endure. That's not natural, Pritchard says on the video. That's not possible unless he was still alive when they buried him, and he tried to turn, tried to claw his way up, and the position set as the body deteriorated. He reaches into the grave. The video shows his hand entering the frame, shows him touching the skull, shows him beginning to lift it, and then the camera drops, pointing at the sky, and all we have is audio. Screaming, but not immediately. First there's a sound like air rushing, like a wind that came from inside the earth rather than from the sky. Then a crack sharp, like breaking wood, but deeper, more resonant. Then Pritchard's voice, no longer scholarly, no longer detached. "Oh God, oh Christ, something. It moved, the skeleton moved. I didn't touch it and it moved." Another crack. Closer, then another. "No, no, 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 no." The screaming begins. It lasts for approximately 40 seconds. Then it cuts off with a wet, final sound that the audio forensics team later described as consistent with structural collapse of the trachea. Then silence. Then, after maybe 10 seconds, a new sound, soft, rhythmic, like someone breathing, or like earth falling on wood. The camera kept recording for another 3 hours, until the battery died. The audio picks up nothing else except that breathing sound, steady and patient, and once, just once, at the very end something that might be words, might be wind, might be the product of microphone distortion and human tendency to find patterns in chaos. Come down, stay down, face down. Silas Ritchie, the younger, found Michael Pritchard at approximately 8:30 that evening, drawn by the sound of the portable winch's generator, which was still running. He approached cautiously, rifle ready, expecting to find grave robbers or teenagers causing trouble. What he found was worse. From his statement to the Breathitt County Sheriff's Department, "I came up on the cemetery just as the sun was setting. The generator was running, but nobody was tending it. I saw the equipment, tools laid out all professional-like, and I saw that someone had moved the capstone from one of the old graves, the one we're not supposed to touch, the one with the warning carved in it. I called out. Nobody answered. I got closer and I saw a man lying next to the open grave, face down, arms spread out. At first I thought he was dead drunk or passed out, but then I saw that his neck was at the wrong angle, and his ribs looked crushed, like something heavy had fallen on him from above. But there was nothing heavy nearby. The capstone was 5 feet away. The tools were scattered, but not on him. Just him, lying there face down next to an open grave that shouldn't have been opened. Then I saw his hands. His fingernails were torn off, and his fingers were bloody, and there was dirt under what was left of the nails. Fresh dirt. He'd been digging with his bare hands, clawing at something. I looked in the grave and saw that the coffin was broken open and the skeleton inside was disturbed. But here's what I can't explain, what I told the sheriff, and he told me not to put in the official report. The skeleton was positioned wrong. The one we'd buried face down, it was now on its side, like it had turned, like it had rolled over to face whoever had opened the grave. And the skull was positioned with the jaw open. And in the jaw, between the teeth, there was a piece of fabric, modern fabric, blue nylon. Same color as the jacket the dead man was wearing, like the skeleton had bitten him. The official report lists Michael Pritchard's death as accidental, caused by traumatic injury consistent with falling object impact. The investigation concluded that he'd somehow dislodged the capstone while digging, and it had fallen on him. This explanation satisfied precisely no one who saw the scene, but it had the advantage of being something that could be written in an official document without making the county look insane. The grave was filled back in immediately. The capstone was replaced. And this time, the community took additional measures that went beyond tradition and into the realm of desperate innovation. They poured concrete around the capstone, sealing it to the earth. They planted blackberry brambles and poison ivy around the grave in a deliberate, dense thicket. And they installed, of all things, a trail camera, the kind hunters used to monitor game, pointed directly at the grave with a solar charger to keep it running indefinitely. We need to know, Silas Ritchie explained to the few family members who questioned this break with tradition. We need to know if anything disturbs it. We need to know if it tries to get out. The camera has been recording for 20 years now. The memory card is changed monthly by Silas or one of his sons. The footage is reviewed, cataloged, and stored in a safety deposit box at the Breathitt County Bank. I've seen 3 months of that footage. I drove to Kentucky in 2023, found Silas through patient networking and careful demonstration that I was serious about understanding rather than sensationalizing. He agreed to show me the footage on the condition that I never specify the exact location of Snake Hill Cemetery, never share the GPS coordinates, never do anything that might guide curiosity, seekers or collectors to the site. I agreed, and now I've seen what that camera records. Most of it is exactly what you'd expect. An overgrown grave in a forest clearing, seasons changing, weather passing through, occasionally a deer or raccoon crossing the frame. Boring, normal, the kind of footage that would put you to sleep if you tried to watch it in real time. But there are anomalies, moments that don't fit the pattern of wildlife and weather. On October 7th, 2013, exactly 100 years to the day after the lumber company incident, the camera recorded 5 hours of footage where the ground above the grave is moving, not dramatically, not Hollywood style with dirt exploding upward, just a subtle, rhythmic rising and falling, like the earth is breathing, like something beneath is trying to push up, trying to break through, trying with patient, inhuman persistence to overcome the weight of capstone and concrete and earth. Then, at exactly midnight, the movement stops, completely, as if whatever was trying knew that its window had passed. On June 21st, each year the summer solstice, the anniversary of Michael Pritchard's death, the camera consistently fails for exactly 3 hours, from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. The battery doesn't die. The camera doesn't malfunction. The recording simply stops, replaced by 3 hours of white noise static that analysis shows contains no discernible pattern or message. But it's the footage from February 14th, 2019 that disturbs me most. A person appears in frame at 2:30 in the morning, not walking into frame appearing, as if they'd materialized between one frame and the next. The figure is indistinct, wrong somehow in its proportions, too tall or too thin or bent at angles that don't match human posture. It approaches the grave, kneels beside the capstone, and appears to be doing something digging, maybe, or trying to move the stone. The figure works at this task for 37 minutes. Then it stops, stands, or unfolds. The motion is wrong. All joints and angles that shouldn't exist, and turns to face the camera directly. The image quality is poor. The distance is too great. The lighting is minimal. But even accounting for all of that, there's something wrong with the face. It's blurred, or in motion, or changing, or maybe it's just that human eyes and human cameras aren't equipped to properly record something that shouldn't exist. The figure stays there, facing the camera, for 17 seconds, then it's gone, not walking away, not moving out of frame, just gone, between one frame and the next, as if it had never been there. Except that the next morning, when Silas went to check the site, he found fresh disturbances in the earth around the capstone, scratches in the concrete, and pressed into the soft mud next to the grave, a print that might have been a hand, might have been a foot, might have been something else entirely. It had 6 digits. The county sheriff measured it at 14 inches long. I need to tell you about something that happened during my visit to Breathitt County, something that I've been reluctant to put in writing because it crosses the line from investigation into personal experience, from observation into participation. After seeing the trail camera footage, after interviewing Silas and 3 of his cousins about the history of Snake Hill, after reading through the archived copies of Margaret Haversham's field notes and the 1913 incident reports, I asked if I could visit the cemetery myself. The request was met with silence. Then Silas said, "Why?" It was a fair question. I didn't have a good answer. I said something about needing to see it firsthand to write about it accurately, about understanding atmosphere and location, about journalistic thoroughness, all true, all inadequate. The real answer, which I didn't speak aloud, was simpler and more troubling. I needed to know if I would feel what Margaret Haversham felt. I needed to test whether the dread, the wrongness, the sense of malevolent presence was real, or was just the product of suggestion and story and the human tendency to feel what we expect to feel. Silas studied me for a long moment, then he said, "You can visit, but there are rules. You follow these rules exactly, or I don't take you. And you don't go there alone because you'll never find it without a guide, and I'll make sure no one else guides you." The rules were specific. Visit during daylight only, arrive by noon, leave by 3 p.m. Don't bring anything to the cemetery except yourself. No bag, no phone, no camera, no notebook. Nothing to record with, nothing to take. Don't touch any of the graves, don't touch the stones. Don't touch the trees within the cemetery boundary. Don't sit down, don't kneel, don't lie down for any reason. Don't speak while you're in the cemetery, not a word, not a whisper. If you feel watched, leave immediately. Don't look around. Don't try to find the source of the feeling. Just turn and walk away. Don't come back. This is a one-time visit. Once is curiosity, twice is invitation. I agreed to all of this. We went the next day, arriving at Snake Hill at 12:30 p.m. on a clear October afternoon with the sun directly overhead and the autumn leaves providing enough light and visibility that the forest felt open, navigable, safe. The cemetery didn't feel safe. I can't adequately describe this. I've been in dozens of old graveyards, Civil War cemeteries, pioneer burial grounds, abandoned church plots where the stones tilt at crazy angles and the names have weathered into illegibility. I've never felt uncomfortable in any of them. Death is sad, but graves themselves are just the marking of an ending, the quiet testimony that someone existed. Snake Hill is different. The wrongness hits you before you see the graves, while you're still walking the last 100 yards through the forest. The temperature drops not metaphorically, not psychologically, but measurably. I was wearing a jacket that had been perfectly comfortable moments before, and suddenly I was cold. The sunlight still filtered through the trees, but it seemed dimmer, drained of warmth. The sounds change. Birds that had been singing went quiet. The usual rustle of small animals in the underbrush ceased. The only sound was wind through leaves, but even that was off, too rhythmic, too much like breathing, too much like wind was coming from below rather than above. Then you see the graves, and the orientation hits you viscerally. Your brain knows that headstones should face east. It knows this the way it knows that water should flow downhill and smoke should rise. Seeing every stone face the opposite direction creates a cognitive dissonance that manifests as physical discomfort. A tightness in the chest, tension in the shoulders, a primal sense that something is backwards, reversed, inverted. I walked among the graves, reading the names I'd researched, seeing the dates that had become familiar. Hiram Collier, 1863, Granny Shade, 1878, Garrett Combs, 1943, and dozens of others, less famous, less documented, but each one buried face, down, facing west, placed in earth that was meant to hold them forever. I followed Silas's rules. I didn't touch anything. I didn't sit. I didn't speak. But I looked. I observed. I tried to approach it as a journalist, as a researcher, as someone seeking truth rather than experience. And then I felt it. The sensation of being watched is hard to describe if you've never experienced it intensely. It's not rational. There's no logical reason why you should be able to feel someone's gaze on you when you can't see them, when they're making no sound, when there's no objective reason to believe anyone is there, but you can feel it. We all can. It's ancient, primal, the instinct that kept our ancestors alive when there were things in the darkness that wanted to eat them. I felt watched at Snake Hill. Not by Silas, who was standing at the edge of the clearing, his presence calm and protective. Not by animals or birds or any living thing I could identify. I felt watched from below, from the earth itself, from 70, 90, however many graves were there, from things that had been face, down for a century or more, things that should be nothing but bones and dust and memory, things that should have no awareness, no agency, no ability to observe or care about the living walking above them. But I felt them watching. I felt their attention like a physical weight, like pressure against my skin, like dozens of pairs of eyes that couldn't see, shouldn't exist, but were looking up through 7 feet of earth and rock and time itself, seeing me, knowing me, remembering me. I left. I followed Silas's rule: when you feel watched, leave immediately. I turned and walked away, fighting the urge to run, fighting the urge to look back over my shoulder, fighting the certainty that if I turned around I would see something that my mind couldn't accept and my eyes couldn't forget. We didn't speak until we were back at Silas's truck, until we'd driven 3 miles back toward town, until the rational world had reasserted itself enough that words seemed possible again. You felt it. Silas said, not a question, yes. I admitted, everyone does. Everyone who's open enough to feel it. The ones who don't, who claim the place is just a normal cemetery with unusual burial practices, they're the ones who are closed off, who've built walls in their minds so thick that nothing can get through. Maybe that's healthier. Maybe that's wisdom. Or maybe, I said, they just weren't paying attention. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then my great-grandfather helped bury Hiram Collier. My great-grandfather was there when the lumber company tried to dig him up. My grandfather installed the trail camera. And someday, my son or my grandson will have to decide what to do when the concrete finally cracks, when the capstone shifts, when whatever's down there gets patient enough or strong enough or angry enough to break through. What will they do? I asked. Same thing we've always done. Silas said, whatever it takes to keep them down. Whatever it takes to keep them contained. Whatever it takes to make sure that some mistakes, some evils, some corruptions of the soul stay buried where they belong. There's a question that haunts anyone who researches Snake Hill Cemetery deeply enough, a question that Margaret Haversham circled around in her notes but never quite asked directly. Were they right? Not right in the moral sense, vigilante justice, extrajudicial execution. Burial practices designed to punish the dead, these are not things we can endorse or celebrate, but right in the practical sense, right in their assessment that something persists beyond death, right in their belief that certain souls require containment. I'm a journalist. I'm trained in skepticism, in verification, in the principle that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in curses. I don't believe that the dead can harm the living or that burial orientation matters to anything except the living people who find meaning in such rituals, but I've seen the trail camera footage of something that appears between frames, something that leaves 6 toed prints in the mud. I've read Margaret Haversham's field notes and watched her neat handwriting deteriorate into frantic scrawl. I've stood in that cemetery and felt the weight of attention from below. I've interviewed 3 generations of the Ritchie family, practical people, sane people, people who farm and hunt and live ordinary lives, except for this one extraordinary thing they guard. And I've researched what happened to Michael Pritchard's collection after his death. His warehouse in Louisville was sold at auction. The contents were dispersed to various collectors, museums, and private buyers. Most of the items were exactly what you'd expect, macabre but ultimately inert objects whose only power was the power of association and suggestion. But 7 items from his collection, 7 specific items that Pritchard had acquired in the 6 months before his death at Snake Hill. Those items have a documented pattern of causing harm to their possessors. A piece of wood from an execution gallows. The collector who bought it developed a respiratory illness that doctors couldn't diagnose, a progressive condition where he felt constantly like he was suffocating, like there was a rope around his neck. The illness resolved completely within 3 days of him selling the item, a brick from a demolished prison where multiple executions had occurred. The woman who purchased it reported that every night at 3 a.m. she would wake to the sound of someone walking in her hallway, someone who would stop outside her bedroom door and stand there until dawn. This continued for 6 months until she buried the brick in her backyard. The walking stopped, but the grass above where she buried it never grew back. A knife that had been used in a murder, its owner stabbed himself in the hand accidentally 3 times in 2 weeks, always in same location, always causing the same injury. The 3rd time, he threw the knife into a river. That night, he dreamed of drowning. I could list the other 4, but the pattern is clear, and here's what makes it relevant. All 7 of those items came from graves. Not from Snake Hill. Pritchard never managed to take anything from Snake Hill except his own death, but from other graves in other places where Pritchard had gone digging for artifacts of evil. The objects themselves aren't haunted. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is that Pritchard, in his obsessive grave robbing, in his violation of burial spaces, in his deliberate seeking of contamination, had opened himself to something that followed him, fed on him, and ultimately consumed him when he violated the one grave that was specifically designed to contain what he'd been courting. He'd spent years knocking on doors that should stay closed. At Snake Hill, something answered. The story of Snake Hill Cemetery doesn't have a clean ending because it's not finished. The graves remain. The bodies remain. The capstones and concrete and brambles and trail cameras are temporary measures. Band-aids applied to a wound that won't heal because it was never meant to heal. The last time I spoke with Silas Ritchie was 3 months ago in December of 2023. He called me, which was unusual. Our communication had always been initiated by me, the researcher seeking information. But this time he had something to tell me. The trail camera had captured new footage. On December 21st, 2023, the winter solstice, the ground above Hiram Collier's grave had shown movement again. Not like the centennial event in 2013, but similar, rhythmic, persistent, lasting for exactly 3 hours, from noon to 3 p.m. It's getting stronger, Silas said, or more active, or more desperate, I don't know which, but the intervals are getting shorter, used to be just the centennial. Then it was every solstice, now it's every solstice and every equinox. 4 times a year, that thing down there tries to break through. What are you going to do? I asked, what can we do? We keep watching, we keep recording, we keep the trail camera charged and the capstone sealed and the coordinates off the internet. We hope that's enough. We hope that 7 feet of earth and 160 years of containment is enough to hold something that refuses to stay dead. And if it's not enough, silence on the line, then we'll do what our ancestors did, whatever it takes. But I'll tell you something that scares me more than the idea of that thing getting loose. What's that? The last reversed burial at Snake Hill was 1943. That's 80 years ago. We haven't needed to do one since, and we've told ourselves that's because people don't do those kinds of evil things anymore, because society is more civilized, because we have laws and mental health care and police. But you know what I think. I think it's because we've stopped recognizing it. We've stopped seeing the kind of corruption that requires containment. We've psychologized it, medicalized it, explained it away until we can't see it for what it is anymore. And that means when it shows up again, when someone does something so evil that the old measures are needed, we won't know what to do. We won't believe it's necessary. We'll bury them normal, facing east, in consecrated ground with everyone else. And then we'll find out why the old ways existed. I'll leave you with one final piece of information, something I discovered only recently, something that connects Snake Hill Cemetery to your world in a way that makes this more than just a historical curiosity or a piece of regional folklore. In the past 20 years, there's been a growing interest in dark tourism, a people who seek out locations associated with tragedy, violence, and death, serial killer houses, disaster sites, execution chambers, and, increasingly, burial grounds with unusual or disturbing histories. Snake Hill Cemetery is on 3 different dark tourism maps available online. The exact location is wrong on all of them. The coordinates point to places miles away from the actual site, which suggests that someone is deliberately providing false information to protect the real location. But the name is there. Description is there. The story is there, usually sensationalized, usually getting the details wrong, but containing enough truth to make it identifiable, which means that people are looking for it. People like Michael Pritchard, collectors and thrill seekers, and those who believe that proximity to evil is somehow transformative or enlightening. The Ritchie family and the remaining old families of Breathitt County do what they can. They don't confirm locations. They don't provide directions. They've created false trails and dead ends and rumors that send curious visitors to empty clearings miles from the actual cemetery, but eventually someone will find it. Someone with GPS and satellite maps, and the kind of persistence that comes from believing they're on the verge of discovering something significant. Someone will move the brambles, break through the concrete, shift the capstone, and open a grave that has been sealed for more than a century and a half. What happens then is not a question of if but when, and here's what I want you to understand. When that happens, it won't just affect Breathitt County, Kentucky. It won't just affect the person who opens the grave or the community that's been guarding it. Because if the belief system that created Snake Hill Cemetery is correct, if some evils do persist beyond death, if some souls do require containment, if some corruptions can spread like spiritual contagion, then releasing them back into the world is not a local problem. It's everyone's problem. The barriers between the dead and the living, between the past and the present, between what we believe is possible and what actually exists in the darker corners of reality, those barriers are thinner than we like to think. And they're maintained not by laws, technology, or modern enlightenment, but by people like the Ritchie family, by traditions that seem barbaric until you understand their purpose, by measures that seem extreme until you understand what they're designed to contain. Snake Hill Cemetery is one of those measures, and it's failing, not tomorrow, maybe not even in our lifetimes, but the concrete is cracking, the capstone is shifting, intervals between disturbances are shortening, and somewhere in Breathitt County, Kentucky, in a cemetery that faces the wrong direction, 72 documented souls lie face down in the earth, 7 feet deep, oriented toward eternal darkness instead of eternal light, waiting, patient, hungry. The story of Snake Hill Cemetery remains not just a historical curiosity, but a living question about the nature of evil, punishment, and the limits of forgiveness, not because of what happened there, but because of what it reveals about how far humans will go to protect themselves from what they fear most, not death itself, but what comes after death when the person who died was already corrupted beyond redemption. But questions remain, questions that haunt. Why do the intervals between disturbances keep shortening? Is the containment weakening, or is what's contained growing stronger? What happened during those 3 hours of white noise on Michael Pritchard's camera? What was being said in that static, and who, or what was speaking? And most troubling, how many other cemeteries like Snake Hill exist in isolated mountain communities across America? Places where the old ways still govern, where graves are reversed and capstones are weighted, where families guard secrets that go back centuries. Perhaps these questions are meant to remain unanswered. Perhaps the not knowing is the protection we deserve for having forgotten why such places existed in the first place. To this day, the trail camera at Snake Hill continues recording, its solar panel keeping it charged, its memory card changed monthly by someone who knows what to look for in the footage. The Ritchie family maintains their vigil, passing the responsibility from generation to generation like a sacred trust that no one wants but everyone understands is necessary. And on silent nights in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, when the fog settles thick in the hollows, when the temperature drops below freezing and the ground above those reversed graves contracts and shifts, people who live near by still report hearing sounds that shouldn't exist, rhythmic, persistent, like someone breathing beneath the earth, like something patient and terrible is counting its breaths until the moment when patience is rewarded and containment fails. Most dismiss it as wind, as imagination, as the mind playing tricks in darkness, but the Ritchie family knows better. They've always known better. If this journey through one of America's most disturbing burial grounds resonated with you, if you find yourself lying awake tonight wondering about the boundaries between justice and vengeance, between protection and punishment, between the mercy we owe the dead and the safety we owe living, then this channel has more truths waiting in the shadows. Subscribe if you're willing to confront the uncomfortable questions about evil, redemption, and the possibility that some doors should never be opened. Leave a like if this account provoked something deeper than entertainment, if it made you question whether death really ends our responsibility for the lives we lived, the harm we caused, the corruption we carried, and in the comments I want to know this. If you discovered that someone in your family had been buried reversed, face down, marked as containing something too dangerous for normal rest, would you want to know why? Would you want to uncover what they did? Or would you accept that some family secrets are kept for the protection of everyone who comes after? Would you advocate for digging up the truth? Or would you argue that some graves are meant to stay closed, some stories are meant to stay buried, some truths are more dangerous than the mystery they would solve? Until next time, remember the most terrifying stories aren't about monsters in the darkness. They're about the realization that the monsters were human once, that they lived in communities like ours, that they made choices we might make if we were desperate enough, frightened enough, convinced enough that we were doing what was necessary. And sometimes the darkness we're really afraid of isn't in the cemetery, 7 feet down, facing west in eternal punishment. Sometimes it's in the mirror, It's in the choices we'd make if we believed our community's survival required it. It's in the question of what we'd do if someone we loved committed the unforgivable. It's in the recognition that the line between the people who bury the evil and the people who are buried for being evil is thinner than any of us want to admit. Snake Hill Cemetery isn't just about the past. It's about the eternal human struggle between mercy and safety, between redemption and containment, between faith that even the worst can be redeemed and fear that some things are beyond saving. And it's about the question we all face eventually, in one form or another, when we die. Which direction will we face? Toward the rising sun and the hope of resurrection, or toward eternal darkness, marked as something that must be contained rather than celebrated, mourned rather than remembered, buried face, down in earth that's meant to hold us forever? The answer, terrifying as it is, depends entirely on the life we live before we're lowered into the ground. Choose wisely, die well, and hope that when your time comes, the living remember you kindly enough to bury you facing east. Because the alternative, the reversed grave, the Western orientation, the face-down positioning, that marks you as containing something that must never rise, that alternative is the worst punishment imaginable, not because of what happens to your body, but because of what it says about your soul.